Hi, my name is Gail Kenning from the Felt Experience and Empathy Lab and Aging Futures Institute at the University of New South Wales. I'm presenting this on behalf of the Felt Experience team, including Scientia Professor Jill Bennett and Fiona White. What I'm going to talk about today is some of the work that we've done, focusing really on understanding lived experience. So I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that we did engaging with older people, older adults, using an arts-based approach. And for this, we engaged with creative activities, took people to see artworks, and really then engaged with them to find out what they thought about the artworks, but also it really uncovered some of their understandings about their own lives. We're framing this discussion in relation to ageing discourse and thinking about the transformative potential of arts engagement. What we recognise when we've been talking to older people is that how the ageing discourse really does impact on how they view themselves, how it shapes their lives, how they engage. So often when we think about ageing, and I think ageism has come to the fore in times of COVID and the pandemic. It's not that it wasn't there before, it's just we're probably seeing it more than ever before. So this ageing and age discourse really sits in this area of ageism being older age being a time of can't do, of deficit, of loss, of lack, that we focus on what we can't do, physical, cognitive limitations. But it's not only that, it's in the social roles as well. In many of the interviews I did with older women, they talk about, after child rearing and even after being grandparents and the grandchildren have grown up, there's no role for them. They're not quite sure what they contribute. And this was particularly so for women. And the idea of becoming a burden became very prevalent. The suggestion they were out of touch. And what was interesting, often this wasn't something that they necessarily felt themselves, but this is how they perceived that community saw them. And so while they were very keen to contribute, they didn't know how to and didn't know whether there was a role for them to do that. So the two arts projects that I'm going to talk about, and I can only really touch the surface on these because we gathered a lot of data. One was in Woollahra in eastern suburbs Sydney, and this was what we called an emotion visualization experience. So we ran a series of workshops that engaged in creative activities in a range of ways, mainly focusing on emotions and around the home and where people lived. And this culminated in an artwork that was shown at the gallery, at the library and a gallery. The second one was using visual matrix approaches for an exhibition called These Walls Could Talk. And the exhibition was a public exhibition in laneways in North Sydney. The visual matrix approach we used is a psychosocial engagement. And what we do here is basically showing people some sort of stimuli. In this case, it was the art exhibition in the laneways. And then gathering people together in a group engagement, asking people to think about the associations that they have with what they've seen, what they've viewed, what they've experienced. We're really looking for associative thinking. So, what does it mean for them? What comes to mind when they look at these works? And not asking them to either be judgmental or analyze what they've seen, or to really think hard about what they've seen. It really is much more of an immediate response is what we're looking for. So, as I mentioned, the Weave workshop, the Woollahra emotion visualization experience. For this, the focus was home and emotions of your relationship to where you live. What was important about those workshops is that we gave people activities to do. So, for example, the first one, we asked them to focus on their emotions, and we used Plutchik's Wheel of Emotion to get people to talk about emotions. What we found is very quickly that the conversation moves away from the structured approach that we had, and people start talking about a range of things that are important in their lives. So they bring in associations, they bring in other things that are important to them. And what we start doing is understanding what's top of mind with people. And this is a way of bypassing some of the performative aspects that we see, that when people, for example, are asked surveys or speak to a researcher, they're often very quickly, they have a sense of knowing what it is you're trying to get. They often will censor themselves to say what they think you want them to say. And they're not, or they may be offering you responses that are practiced. You know, they've heard this question before, they've got a story about their life. You ask them how they feel about growing older, and you know, in a sense, they trot out a formulaic response that they've probably used with family, friends, researchers previously. So this workshop approach, engaging in arts with artworks, is trying to get beyond that, undercut that performative aspect, and find out other ways of how they think about their lives. As I mentioned with the visual matrix, the psychosocial approach, this does a similar type of thing in that, as you can see in the image here, we take people into the laneways, and the work that we were showing them was a series of poems written by younger people who had lived experience of mental health issues. And so the content was quite intense, and we found that the initial response is to go to analysis, to ask why and whether the students did a good job of the poems. And what we really want to do is get beyond that, to get people to start thinking about their own mental health and how what those poems mean to me. And this is a case of getting people to think through association. We found that we're able to work with people with dementia with this approach, and have done this on several occasions now, because it's not asking people to be judgmental or take a line of thought or pursue an argument, or to be able to remember anything. It's actually about associations. What comes to mind when you see this work? What comes to mind when you try and remember this work? And you don't actually necessarily need to remember the work, but what associations come up? And through these approaches, we find that people really start talking about things that matter to them. So this is an example of the workshop that we did with Woollahra. You can see here there's a series of workbooks for them to work through, asking people to write, draw, think about their home in the past, their home now, their community. And by touching on these quite emotive issues, we've found that people started talking not so much about what they did in the past, but about the impact on their lives now, how they thought of themselves. We asked them to draw a plan of the house that they first lived in, a house that they lived in, which perhaps was their favourite house, and their house now. And through these sorts of thinking and associating their relationship to home, people started telling us about things like, one of the top issues for most people in this project was the need to do things. They wanted to have activities. They wanted to always be busy. They didn't want to have times where they were left to think for too long. And this was, we noticed, was a strategy that people were using, that while they would say they enjoyed their own company, they would often counter that by saying, but you have to have things to do and you have to go and see people and you have to keep in touch. And this all came about from talking about home. In the These Walls Could Talk visual matrix, we took people along a laneway, an urban laneway, an industrial laneway, so a place that they're not really familiar with, to see these artworks. And whilst it was a very hot day, or some of the days that we did this were very hot, and there was some discomfort, all of the participants really enjoyed this activity of getting out and being somewhere that they wouldn't expect to be. There were physical and cognitive limitations in the people we spoke to. And this became evident as we engaged. After looking at the artwork, we then got together in a discussion through association. We also had groups of people writing poems in response, which was really very interesting, the types of things that they chose to talk about. And we also had a little bit of feedback analysis work with people, getting them to think about what it was that we talked about in the visual matrix. And the image at the bottom shows a very interesting intergenerational visual matrix program based on this work in the laneways that we analysed. What we found was, as I suggested at the beginning, is that there was quite a lot of self-censoring that happened. People would very quickly go to a point of starting to talk about things they were not comfortable with, and then stopping themselves, saying, and as you can see in this text, you know, you've got to get out, you've got to do this, you can't just dwell on this. Be grateful for what you have. We're so blessed. Focus on the positive. And we recognized that people were doing this, and there was a level of self-motivation, but we also recognized that people were feeling censored by, for example, family members who might say to them, oh, you know, what have you got to be miserable about? You're very lucky, or, you know, you can't complain, or we don't want to hear you complain. So this, we found, came up often. The similar thing we found was in These Walls Could Talk. And this is from an example where a gentleman was talking about his concerns, thinking about dying. And he often thought about this as he was going to sleep or when he woke up in the night. We asked him whether it was concerning to him. He was not concerned, but he just wanted to have these types of conversations. So what we're thinking now is that there's still ways that we need to engage people to find space for people to say what's important to them. You know, what is the meaning in their life? So the transformative potential, as researchers, we gather data, we look at data, and we start thinking about what does that mean? What does it say? Here, in engaging in looking at artworks, we find that it starts changing people, that people find that perhaps they are thinking about things that they never thought about before. And through this, there is a transformative potential for the arts in this space. If you'd like any more details about this project or any of the other lived experience work that we're doing, please don't hesitate to contact us.